"You are in the wrong seat," the flight attendant whispered, her voice tight. "And the man beside you owns this entire jet." The words hit Chloe Bennett like sudden turbulence, sharp and disorienting, but she did not move, not yet. The soft hum of the engines filled the private cabin, low and steady, like a secret breathing beneath polished luxury. Warm amber lights reflected off smooth leather seats and brushed metal finishes, a world that did not belong to her. Just 10 minutes earlier, she had rushed up the narrow stairs of the aircraft, heart racing, clutching a worn canvas bag that held everything she had left. A last-minute ticket, a mistake at the gate, or maybe something else. She had scanned the seat numbers too quickly, her mind still spinning from the eviction notice folded in her pocket, the unpaid bills, the email that began with the words "We regret to inform you." And now she was here, seated beside a man who had not said a word, his presence calm, almost unsettling, as if the chaos in her life could not reach him. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Chloe finally turned her head, slowly, as if afraid the moment might shatter if she moved too fast. The man beside her sat perfectly still, dressed in a simple dark jacket that somehow looked more expensive than anything she had ever owned. His hands rested loosely in his lap, fingers relaxed, but there was a quiet authority in the way he held himself, like someone used to being obeyed without speaking. He glanced at her then, just once, his eyes steady and unreadable, and for a brief second, the noise in her mind faded. No judgment, no curiosity, just silence. The kind of silence that made her feel seen and invisible at the same time. She swallowed, forcing a small, awkward smile. "I think I might have taken the wrong seat," she said, her voice softer than she intended. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, not quite anything she could name. Outside the oval window, the runway stretched into the distance, shimmering under the late afternoon sun. Inside, the air felt different, heavier, charged with something she could not explain. The flight attendant lingered a few steps away, waiting, unsure whether to insist or retreat. And then the man beside her spoke, his voice calm, low, and certain. "Let her stay." Just 3 words, but they shifted everything. The attendant hesitated, then nodded, stepping back as if the decision had already been made long before she asked the question. Chloe blinked, her breath catching slightly. She did not understand why he had said that, or why it mattered so much, but something inside her chest tightened, like the first note of a story she was not ready to hear. The engines roared louder, the plane beginning to move, and Chloe realized, with a quiet, growing certainty, that this mistake was not going to be something she could simply walk away from. The jet climbed steadily into the late afternoon sky, the city below shrinking into a patchwork of gray and gold, but inside the cabin the air felt strangely still, as if time itself had slowed to watch what would happen next. Chloe kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, her fingers pressing into the worn fabric of her bag, grounding herself in something familiar while everything else around her felt unreal. She had never been this close to luxury before, not like this, not where every surface gleamed and every movement seemed intentional. Across from her, a glass of sparkling water rested untouched, the tiny bubbles rising in perfect silence, a detail so small, yet so precise it made her chest tighten. She stole another glance at the man beside her, still unsure what to make of him, or of what had just happened. He had spoken only once, yet that single sentence had carried weight, the kind of weight that did not need explanation. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady, breaking the silence between them. He turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge her, his expression calm, almost distant, as if he were used to gratitude but did not expect it. "For letting me stay," she added, feeling suddenly aware of how out of place she must look. Her shoes were scuffed, her coat too thin for the season, her entire life compressed into the small bag at her feet. He studied her for a brief moment, not with judgment, but with something closer to curiosity, like he was trying to understand a story he had not been told yet. "It did not seem like a mistake worth correcting," he said, his voice even, measured, each word deliberate. Chloe let out a small breath she did not realize she had been holding, a nervous laugh escaping before she could stop it. You might think differently if you knew how many mistakes I have made this week, she replied, attempting to lighten the moment, though the truth behind her words lingered heavily beneath the surface. The engines hummed softly around them, a constant reminder that they were suspended between two places, neither here nor there, just moving forward without pause. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and Chloe wondered if she had said too much. Then, unexpectedly, he asked, "Where are you headed?" The question was simple, but it caught her off guard, as if he had asked something much deeper than the destination printed on her ticket. She hesitated, then gave the safest answer she could. "Los Angeles," she said, her voice careful, guarded. "New start." His gaze did not waver. "And what are you leaving behind?" The question landed softly, but it carried an edge that made her throat tighten. She looked down at her hands, at the faint ink stains on her fingers from sketches she had drawn in better moments. And for a second, she considered lying. But something about the quiet honesty in his tone made that impossible. "Everything," she admitted, the word barely above a whisper. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the jet adjusted its altitude, casting softer shadows across his face, revealing lines of thought that had not been visible before. He leaned back just a fraction, his posture relaxed, yet there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, as if her answer had changed something. "That can be an advantage," he said after a moment, his voice lower now, more reflective. "When there is nothing left, there is nothing holding you in place." Chloe looked at him, really looked this time, trying to reconcile the calm certainty in his words with the man sitting beside her. "That sounds like experience," she said quietly. A faint pause followed, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "It is," he answered. Outside, clouds stretched endlessly beneath them, bright and untouched, a world above the one she had known. Chloe reached into her bag, pulling out a small, worn sketchbook, the edges frayed, the pages filled with lines that told stories she had never spoken aloud. She hesitated for a second, then opened it, flipping to a blank page. The pencil moved almost instinctively in her hand, sketching the curve of the cabin, the angle of the window, the quiet presence beside her. She did not notice when his gaze shifted to the page, or when his attention sharpened slightly, no longer distant but focused. "You draw," he said, not as a question, but as a realization. Chloe nodded, a small smile forming despite herself. "It is the only thing I have never gotten wrong," she said softly. For the first time, something in his expression changed, subtle but unmistakable, like a door opening just enough to let light through. And in that quiet moment, somewhere between the sky and whatever waited for them on the ground, the distance between a girl with nothing left and a man who seemed to have everything began, slowly, to disappear. The steady rhythm of the engines continued, but something in the air began to shift, subtle at first, like a quiet warning carried beneath the calm. Chloe barely noticed it at the beginning. She was too focused on the lines forming beneath her pencil, the soft scratch against paper grounding her in a way nothing else could. The curve of the cabin, the reflection of light along the window, even the faint outline of the man beside her, she captured it all instinctively, as if drawing could anchor this strange moment in reality. Then the first jolt came. It was not violent, but it was enough to make her hand pause mid-stroke. A slight drop, a shift in weight, like the plane had exhaled too quickly. Chloe froze, her breath catching, her eyes lifting toward the window as the endless white clouds seemed to ripple beneath them. The seatbelt sign chimed softly overhead, a calm sound that somehow made her chest tighten more. She glanced around, noticing how the flight attendant moved quickly but quietly down the aisle, her expression composed, practiced. Still, there was something in the way her shoulders held tension that Chloe could not ignore. "Is that normal?" Chloe asked, her voice lower now, the earlier ease replaced with uncertainty. The man beside her did not react immediately. He looked forward, his gaze steady, as if listening to something beyond what anyone else could hear. Then he nodded once. "Turbulence," he said simply. But even as he spoke, the plane dipped again, slightly sharper this time, causing the glass of water on the tray to tremble, tiny ripples distorting its perfect surface. Chloe's fingers tightened around the edge of her seat. She hated flying. She always had. The lack of control, the invisible forces holding them in the air, it made her feel small in a way she could never quite explain. Another drop followed, longer this time, and a quiet gasp escaped her before she could stop it. Without thinking, she reached out, her hand brushing against his. The contact was brief, instinctive, but she pulled back quickly, embarrassed. "Sorry," she whispered, her cheeks warming. "I just do not like this part." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he turned his hand slightly, not pulling away, but allowing hers to rest there if she needed it. "It will pass," he said, his voice calm, steady in a way that did not match the movement of the plane. "These aircraft are built for this." Chloe nodded, though she was not sure if she believed him or simply wanted to. The cabin lights dimmed slightly again as the jet adjusted its altitude, and the hum of the engines deepened, louder now, more present. Across the aisle, one of the crew members leaned toward another, speaking quietly, too low to hear, but the urgency in their posture was unmistakable. Chloe noticed it this time. Her eyes flicked back to the man beside her. "You sound very sure," she said, trying to keep her voice light, though the tension in her chest was growing. "Do you fly a lot?" He exhaled slowly, his gaze still forward, his expression unreadable. "More than most," he replied. Another sudden drop interrupted them, stronger than before, causing a few loose items to shift slightly. Chloe's hand tightened again, this time not pulling away. She closed her eyes for a second, trying to steady her breathing. In that moment, the noise of her life, the eviction, the rejection, the fear of what came next, it all blurred into something distant. There was only this, the plane, the movement, the unknown. And strangely, the presence beside her. When she opened her eyes again, she noticed something different. He was not looking at the turbulence anymore. He was watching the crew. Not casually, but carefully, his attention sharp, calculating, as if he were reading something beneath their calm expressions. The flight attendant approached them once more, her smile polite but thinner now. "Everything is fine," she said, though no one had asked. Chloe nodded, but the man beside her did not respond. Instead, he asked quietly, "How long?" The attendant hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "We should be clear soon," she replied, then moved on. Chloe felt it then, not just fear, but something else, something deeper. A realization that whatever was happening, he understood it in a way she did not. She turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You asked that like you already knew the answer." For the first time since the turbulence began, he looked directly at her, his eyes steady, serious now. "I know when something is not routine," he said. Another tremor ran through the plane, longer this time, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the movement itself. Chloe swallowed hard, her fingers still lightly resting against his hand, her mind racing. And as the aircraft pushed forward into a sky that no longer felt entirely calm, she realized that this was not just a simple flight, and the man sitting beside her was not just a stranger who had let her keep the wrong seat. The next drop came harder than the ones before, sharp enough to pull a quiet gasp from somewhere deeper in Chloe's chest, the kind of sound that came from instinct rather than thought. The cabin seemed to tilt for just a second too long before leveling out again, and the once calm hum of the engines now carried a low, strained edge beneath it. Chloe's grip tightened, her fingers curling instinctively around his hand, without hesitation this time. No apology, no second-guessing. Her eyes flicked toward the aisle, watching as one of the flight attendants steadied herself against the seat backs, her polished composure slipping just enough to reveal something real underneath. "This is not just turbulence, is it?" Chloe said, her voice quieter now, not panicked but searching, as if she already knew the answer and was hoping to be told she was wrong. The man beside her did not respond immediately. His gaze moved once more toward the front of the cabin, then to the subtle movements of the crew, then back to the window where the clouds no longer looked soft but fractured, layered, unpredictable. When he finally spoke, his voice was still calm, but there was a firmness now, a clarity that had not been there before. "No," he said, "it is not." The honesty in that single word settled over her like a weight, heavier than fear because it left no room for denial. Another tremor followed, less violent but longer, like the plane was pushing through something unseen and unwilling to let them pass easily. Chloe swallowed, forcing herself to breathe steadily, in and out, just like she had taught herself during nights when anxiety would creep in without warning. "Then what is it?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. He shifted slightly in his seat, his posture no longer relaxed but engaged, alert in a way that made it clear he was no longer just a passenger observing the situation. "Unstable air pocket," he said. "Possibly a system shift ahead. The pilot is adjusting altitude to avoid the worst of it." Chloe stared at him, confusion mixing with fear. "You sound like you are part of the crew," she said. His eyes flicked to hers for a brief moment, and there it was again, that pause, that small gap where something unspoken lived. "I have spent enough time in the air to recognize patterns," he replied, deflecting just enough to avoid answering fully. Across the cabin, a faint announcement began to come through the overhead speakers, the pilot's voice controlled but tighter than it should have been. He spoke about temporary instability, about safety, about remaining seated, but Chloe barely heard the words. She was watching the man beside her now, noticing the way his attention did not drift, the way he listened not just to what was said, but to what was not. Another sudden drop followed, longer this time, and a few items shifted audibly somewhere behind them. Chloe flinched, her body reacting before her mind could catch up. His hand tightened slightly in response, not pulling away, not restraining her, just there, steady, grounding. "Look at me," he said quietly. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then did. His expression was calm, focused, unshaken in a way that felt almost impossible given the movement around them. "Breathe," he added. "Slow. You are not in danger." The certainty in his voice cut through the rising noise in her head. She inhaled slowly, then exhaled, her shoulders lowering just slightly as she followed his rhythm. Another breath, then another. The world outside the window blurred again as the plane pushed forward, but inside, something shifted. Not the fear, not entirely, but the way she held it. "How can you be so sure?" she asked, her voice softer now, less strained. He held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, as if weighing how much to say. "Because I know the people flying this aircraft," he said. The answer hung in the air between them, quiet but loaded with meaning. Chloe blinked, her mind catching on the words, turning them over, trying to fit them into something that made sense. "You know them," she repeated. Before he could respond, the flight attendant returned once more, her steps quicker now, her smile more practiced than real. "We may be making a brief adjustment to our route," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Everything remains under control." Chloe nodded automatically, but her eyes shifted back to him immediately after. He was already watching the attendant, his expression sharper now, the calm surface giving way to something deeper, something closer to authority than observation. And in that moment, as the plane continued forward through uncertain skies, Chloe realized that whatever story she thought she had stepped into when she took the wrong seat, it was changing, and the man beside her was no longer just part of it. He was at the center of it. The tremors did not stop, but something inside Chloe began to settle, not because the situation had improved, but because the man beside her had not changed. While everything else shifted, dropped, and strained, he remained the same, steady in a way that felt almost unnatural, like he existed outside the chaos rather than inside it. Another low vibration moved through the aircraft, longer this time, and the sound of the engines deepened again, not louder, but heavier, as if the jet was pushing harder against something unseen. Chloe swallowed, her eyes drifting back to her sketchbook still open in her lap, the unfinished lines of the cabin staring back at her like a frozen moment from before everything changed. She let out a small breath and picked up her pencil again, her hand slightly unsteady. At first, then slowly finding its rhythm. "You are drawing right now," he said, a hint of surprise threading through his otherwise controlled voice. Chloe gave a small shrug, her eyes still on the page. "If I do not, I will just sit here imagining everything that could go wrong," she said quietly. "This is better." The pencil moved again, sketching sharper lines now, not just the calm version of the cabin she had started, but the reality of it, the tension in the air, the slight tilt in perspective, the subtle expressions of people trying to remain composed. Without realizing it, she began to draw him too, not in full detail, but enough to capture the way he sat, the stillness, the quiet authority that no longer felt accidental. He watched her for a moment, something thoughtful passing behind his eyes, before he leaned back slightly, his attention shifting once more to the front of the cabin. Another brief exchange between crew members caught his focus, their voices low, but their urgency harder to hide now. They are preparing for a route change, he said, more to himself than to her. Chloe looked up immediately. Is that bad? She asked. He shook his head slightly. It means they are being careful, he replied. It means they are not ignoring the conditions ahead. Chloe nodded slowly, trying to absorb the reassurance, even if it came wrapped in uncertainty. She glanced down at her sketch again, then hesitated before turning it slightly toward him. It is not finished, she said, almost apologetically. He looked at it, really looked this time, his attention no longer divided. The lines were raw, imperfect, but alive, capturing something deeper than the surface of the scene. The movement, the tension, the contrast between calm and instability. You see things most people miss, he said quietly. Chloe let out a soft breath, not quite a laugh, not quite relief. I see what I feel, she answered. Another subtle shift ran through the plane, less violent now but still present, like a reminder that they were not out of it yet. He nodded slightly, as if her words had confirmed something he had already begun to suspect. That is rare, he said. Most people only see what they expect. Chloe glanced at him, studying his face again, trying to piece together the contradictions. The calm, the knowledge, the way the crew seemed to orbit around his presence without acknowledging it directly. And what do you see? She asked, her voice softer now, more curious than afraid. For a moment, he did not answer. His gaze moved past her, toward the window, toward the endless stretch of sky that no longer looked entirely peaceful. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that had not been there before. I see someone who is not supposed to be here, he said, then paused, his eyes returning to hers. And yet, somehow, exactly where she needs to be. The words settled between them, quiet but undeniable. Chloe felt her chest tighten again, but not from fear this time. Something else. Something unfamiliar. Outside, the clouds began to thin slightly, patches of clearer sky breaking through, but the tension inside the cabin had not fully lifted. Across the aisle, the flight attendant paused near the front, glancing back for just a second before quickly looking away, as if she had almost made eye contact with him and thought better of it. Chloe noticed it now, fully this time. The subtle shift in behavior. The unspoken awareness. She turned back to him slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. You keep saying things like you are not just guessing, she said. Like you already know what is going to happen. He held her gaze, steady, unflinching, and for the first time since she had sat down beside him, there was no deflection, no redirection, no distance. Just truth, waiting at the edge of being spoken. And as the aircraft continued forward into uncertain skies, Chloe realized that whatever answer he was about to give, it would change everything she thought she understood about this flight, and about the man who had told her to stay in the wrong seat. The silence stretched for a fraction longer than Chloe expected, long enough for her heartbeat to rise again, not from fear this time, but from anticipation. The aircraft continued forward, the turbulence softening into uneven ripples rather than sharp drops. Yet the tension inside her had shifted into something more focused, like she was standing at the edge of understanding something she could not yet fully see. He did not look away from her, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was no distance left in it. Because I have been through this before, he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight, the kind that hinted at experience rather than assumption. Chloe held his gaze, searching his expression for something more, something that would explain the certainty behind his tone. You mean turbulence, she said, trying to keep her voice light, though she knew that was not what he meant. He shook his head slightly. No, he replied. I mean losing everything and starting again. The answer caught her off guard, shifting the moment in a way she had not expected. For a second, the plane, the noise, the uncertainty outside, all of it faded into the background. There was only that sentence, and the quiet honesty behind it. Chloe blinked, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of her sketchbook. You do not seem like someone who has lost anything, she said softly. It was not a challenge, just an observation shaped by everything she could see. The calm, the control, the way he carried himself like the world rarely pushed back against him. He let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting briefly toward the window before returning to her. That is because you are only seeing the version that came after, he said. The engines hummed steadily beneath his words, the sound now almost comforting compared to the earlier tension. Chloe hesitated, then asked, "What happened?" The question came out quieter than she intended, but she did not take it back. He studied her for a moment, as if deciding whether to answer, then leaned back slightly in his seat. "There was a time," he began, his voice lower now, more reflective, "when I thought I had control over everything. Every decision. Every outcome. I built something I believed could not fail." He paused, his jaw tightening just slightly, a small shift that revealed more than his words. And then it did. Chloe listened without interrupting, her attention fully on him now, the rest of the cabin fading into background noise. "Bad investment," he continued. "Wrong people. I trusted the wrong signals." His eyes flickered briefly, not with regret exactly, but with the memory of something that had forced change. "In less than a year, everything I had built collapsed. Reputation, money, stability." Chloe felt a quiet ache in her chest, a recognition that went beyond sympathy. "What did you do?" she asked. He looked at her again, and this time there was something different in his expression, something closer to respect. "The same thing you are doing," he said. "I kept going." The simplicity of the answer settled over her, grounding in a way she did not expect. Outside, the clouds began to break apart more clearly now, patches of blue sky opening between them, the light shifting from muted gray to something warmer. The turbulence eased into a gentle, almost steady motion, though the earlier tension still lingered in the air. Chloe let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she looked back down at her sketchbook. Without thinking, she added new lines to the page, sharper now, more defined, capturing not just the cabin but the feeling of it, the moment of transition between instability and calm. "I do not feel like I am moving forward," she admitted quietly. "It just feels like everything is gone." He watched her draw for a moment before responding. "It only feels like that at the beginning," he said. "When there is nothing left, it is easy to think there is nowhere to go. But that is not true." Chloe glanced up at him. "Then what is true?" she asked. He met her gaze steadily. "That you are no longer tied to anything that was holding you back," he said. "Even if you do not see it yet." The words lingered, quiet but powerful, and Chloe felt something shift inside her, not a solution, not clarity, but the first small crack in the weight she had been carrying. Across the aisle, the flight attendant finally allowed her shoulders to relax slightly, the tension in her posture easing as the aircraft stabilized. The overhead lights softened, the hum of the engines returning to its earlier, smoother rhythm. Chloe looked back at the man beside her, seeing him differently now, not just as someone calm in a storm, but as someone who had already survived one. "You talk like you built it all again," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, then gave the faintest nod. "I did." The answer was simple, but it carried something undeniable, something that made the earlier pieces begin to align in Chloe's mind. The knowledge, the authority, the way the crew had moved around him without question. She did not have the full picture yet, but she could feel it forming. And as the plane moved into clearer skies, Chloe realized that the turbulence had not just shifted the flight, it had shifted something between them, turning a stranger into someone whose story was now beginning to intertwine with her own. The aircraft had settled into a smoother rhythm, but Chloe could still feel the echo of the earlier turbulence in her chest, like a memory her body had not yet let go of. Outside the window, the sky had opened into a vast stretch of blue, calm and endless, as if nothing had ever been wrong, as if the chaos they had just passed through had been nothing more than a passing illusion. But inside the cabin, something had changed, and Chloe could not ignore it anymore. She closed her sketchbook slowly, her fingers lingering on the worn cover, then turned toward him again, her gaze more certain now, more searching. "You rebuilt everything," she said quietly. "That is not something most people can do." He did not answer right away. His eyes shifted briefly toward the front of the cabin, where one of the crew members had just stepped out from behind the partition separating the cockpit. The man moved with purpose, scanning the cabin quickly before his gaze landed on the seat beside Chloe. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. Then something subtle but unmistakable happened. The crew member straightened, his posture tightening, and he gave the smallest nod of acknowledgement before quickly looking away, as if the interaction had never occurred. Chloe saw it clearly this time. There was no pretending she had imagined it. She turned back to the man beside her, her heartbeat picking up again, but not from fear. "They know you," she said, her voice low but steady. It was not a question. He exhaled slowly, as if he had expected this moment to come sooner or later. For a brief second, the calm mask he had worn since the beginning slipped, not entirely, but enough to reveal something beneath it. Not discomfort, not regret, something closer to acceptance. "Yes," he said. The single word landed heavier than any explanation could have. Chloe stared at him, her mind racing, connecting the pieces she had been trying to understand since the moment she sat down in the wrong seat. The authority in his voice. The way the flight attendant had stepped back without argument. The way the crew moved around him, aware but restrained. "You are not just a frequent passenger," she said slowly. His gaze met hers again, steady, direct, no longer avoiding the truth. "No," he replied. The answer was simple, but it changed everything. Chloe let out a small breath, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of her seat. "Then who are you?" she asked. The question hung between them, quiet but unavoidable. He studied her for a moment, as if measuring something beyond the words themselves, then leaned back slightly, his posture shifting into something more open, more honest. "My name is Ethan Carter," he said. The name meant nothing to Chloe at first. It was just a name, another piece of information in a day that had already given her too many unexpected turns. She frowned slightly, searching her memory, but came up empty. "Should I know that name?" she asked, a hint of uncertainty in her voice. For the first time since she had met him, something close to a real smile touched his expression, faint but genuine. "Most people in this cabin would," he said. Chloe glanced around instinctively, her eyes moving across the polished interior, the quiet luxury, the subtle signs that this was not a normal flight. Then she looked back at him, her confusion deepening. "I am not most people," she said softly. His expression shifted again, that faint smile lingering just enough to soften the edge of the moment. "No," he said. "You are not." There was a pause, not awkward, but filled with something new, something unspoken but growing between them. Chloe felt it, a shift in the air, like the moment just before a truth fully reveals itself. "I built this company," he continued, his voice calm but carrying a quiet weight now. "Carter Aviation." The words settled over her slowly, like a realization that needed time to take shape. Chloe blinked, her eyes widening just slightly as the pieces finally locked into place. The jet, the crew, the authority, the way everything had aligned around him without explanation. "This plane," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded once. "Yes." The confirmation sent a quiet shock through her, not loud, not dramatic, but deep, like something shifting at the foundation of what she thought she understood. Chloe leaned back slightly. In her seat, her mind racing to catch up. Just hours ago, she had been standing outside an apartment she could no longer afford, holding everything she owned in a single bag. And now she was sitting on a private jet, beside the man who owned it, the man who had told her to stay, who had held steady while everything else moved. "So I really am in the wrong seat," she said quietly. Ethan shook his head, his gaze steady, unwavering. "No," he said. "You are exactly where you are supposed to be." The words settled into her, deeper than she expected, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly ahead, clear and open, and inside the cabin, the distance between them felt smaller than it had just minutes before. But Chloe knew, even without saying it, that this was only the beginning of something she did not yet fully understand, and whatever came next would change more than just the rest of this flight. The clarity of the sky outside should have brought relief, but for Chloe, it only made everything feel sharper, more real, as if the calm had stripped away any illusion she could hide behind. She sat there for a moment, her mind still catching up with the weight of what he had just said, repeating his name silently, as if it might suddenly mean something different the second time. Ethan Carter, the owner of the jet, the man who had built the company, the man who had just told her she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Chloe let out a slow breath, her fingers brushing over the edge of her sketchbook again, grounding herself in something familiar before she spoke. "You could have told me earlier," she said quietly. There was no accusation in her voice, just a simple truth, one that felt heavier now that she understood who he was. Ethan did not look surprised by the statement. If anything, he seemed to have expected it. Would it have changed anything? He asked. Chloe hesitated. The honest answer came faster than she expected. Yes, she said. I would not have talked to you the same way. The admission hung in the air between them, unfiltered and real. Ethan nodded once, as if confirming something he had already known. That is exactly why I did not say anything, he replied. Chloe frowned slightly, her gaze searching his face. You did not want me to know, she said. I wanted to know who you were without the title, he corrected gently. The words settled into her, and for a moment, she did not know how to respond. Because he was right. If she had known, she would have been careful, measured, guarded in a way she had not been with him. She would have chosen her words differently. She would have hidden the truth instead of offering it freely. Chloe looked down briefly, then back at him. And now that I know, she asked softly, what happens? The question was simple, but it carried more than just curiosity. It carried the uncertainty of everything that came next. Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze steady, thoughtful. Now, he said, we continue the flight. Chloe let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though there was no humor in it. That is not what I meant, she said. He watched her for a moment longer. Then his expression softened, just slightly. I know, he said. There was a pause, quieter than before, not tense, but filled with something that felt like a turning point. Chloe glanced around the cabin again, noticing how nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The same seats, the same quiet hum, the same sky stretching endlessly outside the window. But now she could see the invisible lines connecting everything back to him. The control, the decisions, the world he belonged to, a world she had never even been close to before. I do not belong here, she said suddenly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Ethan's gaze did not waver. You said the same thing when you sat down, he replied. And yet, you are still here. Chloe shook her head slightly. That was before I knew, she said. This is different. He tilted his head just slightly, studying her, not dismissing her words, but not agreeing with them either. Is it? He asked. Chloe opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out, because she was not entirely sure. The truth was, something inside her had shifted, not just because of who he was, but because of how he had spoken to her, how he had listened, how he had not treated her like she was. Out of place even when she clearly was. You think I am going to ask you to leave? He said after a moment, his voice calm, almost thoughtful. Chloe blinked, caught off guard by the accuracy of it. I did not say that, she replied quickly. You did not have to, he said. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to soften the tension. If I wanted you gone, you would not still be sitting there. The certainty in his tone left no room for doubt. Chloe felt her chest tighten again, but not from fear, not anymore. Something else. Something she did not have a name for yet. She looked down at her sketchbook again, then slowly turned it back toward him, almost without thinking. I was drawing before everything got complicated, she said. Now it feels different. Ethan looked at the page, his expression thoughtful as he took in the sharper lines, the tension captured in the details. That is because you see more now, he said quietly. Chloe glanced up at him, her voice softer than before. Or maybe I just understand less, she said. Ethan held her gaze, steady and certain. That is where everything starts, he replied. The words settled into the space between them, quiet but meaningful, and for the first time since he revealed who he was, Chloe did not feel like she was in the wrong place. She felt like she was standing at the beginning of something she did not yet fully understand, but somehow, she was no longer afraid of it. The descent began so smoothly that Chloe almost did not notice it at first, just a subtle shift in pressure, a slight angle in the horizon outside her window, the clouds slowly giving way to the distant outline of land below. The cabin remained quiet, controlled, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if the turbulence, the tension, the revelation, had all been folded neatly into the past. But for Chloe, nothing felt the same anymore. She sat still, her sketchbook resting lightly in her hands, her thoughts moving faster than the aircraft carrying her toward a future she had not planned. Across from her, the polished surfaces reflected the soft light of the late afternoon, and beyond them, the city began to take shape, a sprawling grid of streets and buildings, stretching endlessly under the fading sun. Los Angeles. A new start, she had said. But now, that phrase felt different, heavier, as if it carried possibilities she had never imagined before. "We will be landing shortly." The pilot's voice came through the overhead speaker, steady and composed, as if the earlier uncertainty had never existed. Chloe exhaled slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of her sketchbook before she closed it completely, as if sealing the moment inside. She turned slightly toward Ethan, studying him again, this time not as a stranger, not even as the man who owned the jet, but as someone who had stepped into her story without warning and changed its direction. "So this is it," she said quietly. He glanced at her, his expression calm, but there was something else there now, something she could not quite name. "For the flight," he replied. Chloe nodded, though the answer felt incomplete. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but filled with the weight of what had passed between them in such a short time. She looked down briefly, then back at him. "I am glad I took the wrong seat," she said, her voice softer now, more certain than she expected. Ethan held her gaze for a moment, and for the first time, the faint smile that touched his expression felt less guarded, more real. "So am I," he said. The simplicity of the exchange settled into her, grounding and unsettling at the same time. The aircraft lowered further, the city now clearly visible, the details sharpening with every passing second. Cars moved like small currents through the streets, buildings rising in clusters, each one holding stories she had yet to discover. Chloe felt a familiar tension return, not from fear, but from reality. Because whatever this moment had been, whatever connection had formed between them in the sky, it did not change who they were on the ground. She shifted slightly in her seat, her voice quieter now. "When we land," she began, then stopped, unsure how to finish the thought. Ethan waited, his attention fully on her, patient in a way that made it easier for her to continue. "I go back to being me," she said. "And you go back to being everything else." The words were not bitter, just honest. Ethan considered them for a moment, then leaned slightly closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You were always you," he said. "That does not change when the plane touches the ground." Chloe felt her chest tighten slightly, not from doubt, but from the truth in his words. Still, she shook her head faintly. "It feels like it will," she admitted. The landing gear extended beneath them, a distant mechanical sound that signaled the end of something neither of them had fully prepared for. The cabin shifted slightly as the plane aligned with the runway, the ground rising to meet them. Chloe glanced out the window one last time, taking in the view, the light, the sense of possibility mixed with uncertainty. Then she turned back to him, her expression more composed now, as if she had made a quiet decision. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me stay, for everything." Ethan's gaze softened just slightly, though his posture remained steady, controlled. "You stayed because you chose to," he replied. "Not because I allowed it." The distinction mattered more than she expected. The wheels touched down moments later, a smooth, controlled landing that carried none of the chaos of the earlier flight. The engines roared briefly, then softened as the aircraft slowed, the motion gradually easing until they were no longer suspended between places, but firmly on the ground. Chloe felt it then, the shift from something extraordinary back to something real. The cabin door would open soon. People would move. The moment would end. She looked at him one last time, memorizing the calm in his expression, the quiet strength in his presence, the man who had been both a stranger and something more within the span of a single flight. And as the plane taxied toward its final stop, Chloe realized that whatever happened next, this was not the end of their story. It was only the moment where two very different worlds were about to collide in a way neither of them could fully control. The cabin door opened with a soft mechanical sound, and just like that, the quiet world they had shared in the sky began to dissolve into something louder, sharper, more real. The late afternoon sun poured into the aircraft, warm and golden, casting long shadows across the polished floor as movement returned to the space. Crew members stepped forward with renewed purpose, their calm efficiency now fully visible, their attention shifting quickly to the man beside Chloe. She noticed it immediately, the subtle change in posture, the way their voices lowered when they addressed him, the respect that no longer hid beneath professionalism but stood openly in every gesture. Chloe remained seated for a second longer than necessary, her hand resting on her bag, her sketchbook tucked safely inside, as if holding onto the last piece of the moment before it slipped away completely. Ethan stood first, smooth and unhurried, his presence commanding the space without effort. "Mr. Carter," one of the attendants said quietly, stepping closer, "the car is ready." Chloe felt the words settle in her chest, heavier now that they were spoken aloud, not just implied. Mr. Carter. Not just Ethan. Not just the man who had told her to breathe, who had listened to her, who had seen her before knowing anything about her. He turned slightly toward her, his expression calm, unchanged, as if the shift around him did not affect the way he looked at her. "Do you have somewhere to go?" he asked. The question was simple, but it cut through everything else, grounding her in reality. Chloe hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her bag. The truth was, she did not. Not really. She had a city, a vague plan, a hope that something would work out, but nothing solid, nothing certain. "I will figure it out," she said, forcing a small, steady smile. Ethan studied her for a brief moment, as if weighing the words she had chosen against the truth she had not spoken. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a simple card, clean and understated, yet somehow more significant than anything else in the room. He held it out to her. "If you need anything," he said, his voice low, "call this number." Chloe stared at the card for a second before taking it, her fingers brushing lightly against his as she did. The contact was brief, but it lingered longer than it should have. She glanced down at the card, her eyes scanning the name printed on it, the title beneath, the confirmation of everything she had just learned. Ethan Carter, Chief Executive Officer. The words felt heavier in print than they had in conversation. She looked back up at him, her expression a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why would you help me?" The question was not suspicion, not doubt, just a need to understand something that did not fit into the world she knew. Ethan held her gaze, steady, direct, as if the answer mattered more than the question. "Because someone once helped me when I had nothing," he said. The simplicity of it left no room for argument. Chloe swallowed, her chest tightening slightly as she nodded. "Thank you," she said again, softer this time, more real. A man in a dark suit appeared at the cabin entrance, waiting with quiet patience, his presence another reminder of the world Ethan belonged to. Ethan gave a small nod in acknowledgement, then turned back to Chloe one last time. "Do not disappear," he said. The words were unexpected, quiet but firm, carrying a weight that made her heart skip slightly. Chloe blinked, caught off guard, then gave a small, almost nervous smile. "I was not planning to," she replied. For a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, something that did not need explanation, something that existed outside the differences in their worlds. Then he stepped away, moving toward the exit, the space around him shifting as others followed, as if the center of gravity had changed. Chloe remained where she was, watching as he descended the stairs, greeted by a waiting car, surrounded by a world that moved in response to him. The door remained open, the path clear, inviting her back into a reality that felt both familiar and entirely new. She stood slowly, her bag resting against her shoulder, the card still in her hand. As she stepped toward the exit, she glanced back once, just for a second, as if expecting something to pull her back. But the cabin was empty now, quiet again, the moment already slipping into memory. Outside, the air felt different, warmer, heavier, filled with the noise of a city that did not pause for anyone. Chloe took a slow breath, then stepped down onto the runway, the sunlight catching her face as she moved forward. In her hand, the card felt small, almost insignificant, and yet it carried the weight of something far greater. A choice, a possibility. And as she walked away from the plane that had changed everything, Chloe realized that the wrong seat had not been a mistake at all, it had been the beginning of a path. She could no longer pretend did not exist. Los Angeles did not wait for her. The moment Chloe stepped beyond the private terminal gates, the noise of the city rushed in like a wave, traffic humming in the distance, voices overlapping, sunlight reflecting off glass buildings that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. It felt overwhelming in a way that was both familiar and new, like stepping into a life she had imagined but never truly believed she would live. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, the weight of it grounding her as she moved forward, each step taking her further away from the plane, from the man who had shifted something inside her in ways she could not yet fully explain. The card remained in her hand. She had not put it away. Not yet. Her thumb brushed lightly over the printed letters again, as if confirming that it was real, that the name had not been something she imagined in the strange suspension of that flight. Ethan Carter, Chief Executive Officer. The words still felt distant, like they belonged to a world she had only glimpsed through a window. A black car pulled away from the curb nearby, and for a brief second, Chloe wondered if it was his, if he was already gone, moving forward in a life that did not pause for moments like the one they had shared. The thought settled heavier than she expected. She exhaled slowly and kept walking. Hours passed in a blur of unfamiliar streets and uncertain choices. Chloe found herself in a small coffee shop tucked between two tall buildings, the kind of place that smelled like roasted beans and quiet ambition. She sat by the window, her bag resting at her feet, her sketchbook open again in front of her, though she had not drawn a single line. Instead, she stared at the page, her mind replaying the flight in fragments. His voice, his calm, the way he had looked at her like she belonged exactly where she was. She shook her head slightly, as if trying to clear the memory, then reached into her bag and pulled out the card again. For a moment, she just held it, her fingers tracing the edges, weighing the decision she had been avoiding since she stepped off the plane. "Do not disappear," he had said. The words echoed. In her mind, quiet but persistent. Chloe glanced around the coffee shop, at the people typing on laptops, talking quietly, moving through their lives with purpose. She felt the familiar pull of doubt rise again. What would she even say? Why would someone like him actually expect her to call? She let out a small breath, then set the card down on the table in front of her, staring at it like it might answer the question for her. Minutes passed, maybe more. Time blurred in the quiet hum of the shop. Then, before she could overthink it again, she reached for her phone. Her fingers hesitated for just a second above the screen, then moved, dialing the number printed on the card. The ring sounded louder than it should have, each tone stretching longer than the last. Once, twice, 3 times. Chloe almost pulled the phone away, almost ended the call before it could be answered. Then the line clicked. "This is Carter." His voice came through, calm, direct, unmistakable. Chloe froze for a fraction of a second, her heart skipping as reality caught up with the decision she had just made. "Hi," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "It is Chloe." There was a brief pause, not of confusion, but of recognition settling into place. "I was wondering when you would call," he said. The words caught her off guard, a small, unexpected warmth spreading through her chest. "You were?" she asked, a hint of disbelief slipping into her tone. "I told you not to disappear," he replied. Chloe smiled faintly, her fingers relaxing slightly around the phone. For the first time since she left the plane, the uncertainty that had followed her through the city felt lighter, like it no longer had the same hold over her. "I did not," she said quietly. There was a pause, softer this time, filled with something that felt less like distance and more like possibility. "Where are you?" he asked. Chloe glanced out the window, at the unfamiliar street, the passing cars, the city that still felt too big and too new. Then she answered, her voice steady now. "I am still figuring that out." On the other end of the line, there was the faintest hint of a smile in his voice. "Good," he said. "Then let me help you with that." And in that moment, sitting in a small coffee shop in a city she had never truly known, Chloe realized that the path she had stepped onto the moment she took the wrong seat had not ended when the plane landed. It had only just begun to unfold. The next morning arrived quietly, but nothing about it felt ordinary. Chloe stood outside a building that seemed too polished, too precise, too far removed from the life she had been living just days before. The glass exterior reflected the early sunlight in sharp lines, and the name across the front entrance confirmed what her mind was still trying to accept. Carter Aviation Headquarters. She tightened her grip on her bag, her sketchbook tucked securely inside, the familiar weight reminding her that she had not changed, even if everything around her had. Inside, the lobby stretched wide and open, filled with soft lighting, clean architecture, and people who moved with purpose. Every detail felt intentional, from the quiet hum of conversation to the subtle scent of polished wood and fresh air. Chloe stepped forward slowly, her footsteps softer than she expected against the smooth floor. A receptionist looked up immediately, her expression professional but warm. "Good morning," she said. "How can I help you?" Chloe hesitated for a fraction of a second, then answered, her voice steady despite the tension in her chest. "I am here to see Ethan Carter." The receptionist's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not surprised, but attentive in a different way now. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. Chloe shook her head slightly. "He told me to come," she said. The words felt strange as she said them, as if she were stepping into something she still did not fully understand. The receptionist paused, then nodded politely. "One moment, please." Chloe stood there, her eyes moving around the lobby, taking in the scale of it all, the quiet confidence of a place built on decisions she could not yet imagine making. Minutes passed, though it felt longer, each second stretching slightly as her thoughts tried to catch up with reality. Then she heard it. Her name. Chloe. She turned instantly. Ethan stood at the far end of the lobby, no longer just a presence beside her on a plane, but fully within his world now. He wore a dark suit, tailored perfectly, his posture confident, his expression calm but focused. People moved around him with subtle awareness, their attention shifting as he walked forward, yet none of it seemed to change the way he looked at her. "You came," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet certainty she remembered. Chloe nodded, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her bag. "You told me not to disappear," she replied. A faint smile touched his expression, brief but real. "And you listened," he said. He gestured lightly toward the elevators behind him. "Come with me." Chloe hesitated for just a second, then followed, her steps measured as she entered a space that felt entirely different from anything she had known. The elevator ride was quiet, the soft movement upward marked only by the shifting numbers on the panel. Chloe glanced at her reflection in the mirrored wall, catching sight of her simple clothes, her worn bag, the contrast between her and everything around her more visible than ever. Ethan noticed, but he said nothing until the doors opened. His office was expansive, lined with glass walls that overlooked the city, the view stretching out in every direction, a reminder of how far above everything else they were. Chloe stepped inside slowly, her eyes taking in the space, the light, the sense of control embedded in every detail. "This is your world," she said quietly. Ethan walked past her, setting a folder on the desk before turning back. "It is a world I built," he corrected. Chloe looked at him, her voice softer now. "And I do not belong in it." The words came out before she could stop them, carrying the doubt she had been trying to push aside since she arrived. Ethan stepped closer, his gaze steady, unwavering. "You said that on the plane," he replied. "You were wrong then too." Chloe shook her head slightly. "This is different," she said. "There are people here who have experience, education, everything I do not have." Ethan reached for the folder on the desk and opened it, sliding it toward her. "Look," he said. Chloe hesitated, then stepped forward, her fingers brushing against the edge before she opened it. Inside were sketches. Her sketches. The ones from her notebook, the ones she had drawn on the plane, the ones she thought no one had really seen. Her breath caught slightly. "How did you?" she began, but the question faded before it could fully form. Ethan watched her carefully. "I see potential when it is real," he said. "And yours is." Chloe looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you saying?" He held her gaze, steady and certain. "I want you to design the future cabin concept for this company," he said. The words settled over her slowly, too large to fully grasp all at once. Chloe blinked, her heart racing, her mind struggling to catch up. "You cannot be serious," she said. Ethan did not hesitate. "I am." The silence that followed was not empty, but filled with something powerful, something that marked the shift from possibility into reality. Chloe looked down at the sketches again, then back at him, her voice unsteady but honest. "I do not even know where to start." Ethan's expression softened slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Then start where you always do," he said. "With what you see." And in that moment, standing in a world she never thought she would enter, Chloe realized that the wrong seat had not just changed her direction. It had opened a door she now had to decide whether she was brave enough to walk through. The silence after his words did not feel empty. It felt full, like the moment before something real finally begins. Chloe stood there, the folder still open in her hands, her sketches staring back at her as if they had been waiting for this moment long before she ever stepped onto that plane. For the first time in a long time, the fear she felt was not about losing something. It was about stepping into something she did not yet fully understand. She closed the folder slowly, her fingers steady now, and looked up at Ethan. "If I do this," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "I am not doing it because you offered it to me." He did not interrupt. "I am doing it because I believe I can," she continued. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his expression, not of surprise, but of recognition. "That is the only reason that matters," he said. The decision settled between them, not dramatic, not loud, but firm. Chloe nodded once, a small movement that carried the weight of everything she had walked away from and everything she was choosing now. The days that followed were not easy. They were long, filled with unfamiliar systems, new expectations, and moments where doubt returned without warning. Chloe spent hours in a quiet corner of the design floor, her sketchbook open, translating ideas into something structured, something real. At times, she felt out of place, surrounded by people who seemed more experienced, more certain, more established. But each time that doubt crept in, she remembered the flight, the turbulence, the way she had kept drawing when everything else felt unstable. So she kept going. Slowly, the lines became clearer. Her designs evolved from rough sketches into concepts that carried both emotion and function, blending comfort with space, simplicity with elegance. Weeks passed, then months, and the unfamiliar began to feel like routine. One evening, long after most of the office had emptied, Chloe stood in a hangar beside a full-scale cabin model. It was no longer just an idea on paper. It was real. The soft lighting, the curved seating, the subtle details that made the space feel open yet intimate. Every element reflected the perspective she had carried from the beginning. She stepped back slightly, her breath catching as she took it in fully for the first time. "You turned a moment into something permanent." Ethan's voice came from behind her. Chloe turned, her expression softening as she saw him walking toward her, no longer just the chief executive officer, but the man who had sat beside her when everything felt uncertain. "It started with the wrong seat," she said quietly. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze moving from her to the cabin, then back again. "It started with you choosing to stay," he corrected. Chloe smiled faintly, shaking her head just slightly. "I almost did not," she admitted. "Most people would have moved," he said. "You did not." The hangar was quiet, the city beyond it glowing faintly through the open structure, the night air cool and still. Chloe looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not just the success, not just the authority, but the person who had understood her before she understood herself. "You knew, did you not?" she asked softly. "On the plane." Ethan held her gaze, his answer simple, honest. "I hoped," he said. There was a pause, not uncertain, but full of everything that had built between them since that first moment. Chloe took a small step closer, her voice softer now. "You told me not to disappear," she said. "I did not." Ethan nodded, his expression steady, but warmer than before. "Neither did I," he replied. The distance between them no longer felt like a gap, but a space that had already been crossed. Outside, the city continued to move, unaware of the quiet shift happening inside that hangar. Chloe glanced once more at the cabin behind her, then back at him. "So what happens now?" she asked. Ethan did not hesitate. "Now we build something that lasts," he said. Chloe held his gaze, the answer settling into her with a sense of clarity she had not felt before. The uncertainty that once defined her path had been replaced by something stronger, something chosen. And as she stood there, no longer the girl who had taken the wrong seat, but the woman who had turned it into something more, Chloe realized that some mistakes were not meant to be corrected. They were meant to change everything. And this time, she was exactly where she was supposed to be.